Our speaker for this session is Holly Smith from Rutgers University, and after her talk we'll have comments from our own Sam Rickless. The comments might even be in limerick form. Take it away, Holly.
Thank you, Corey. I'm going to venture here into PowerPointness. I'm sorry this is kind of pale, but you have everything essential on this on your handout, so don't worry if you can't see it too much. The role of omissions in moral theory attracts theoretical attention because in many cases we judge that bringing about a certain effect by virtue of an omission has different moral value than bringing about that same effect by virtue of positive action. Such symmetry is puzzling. I must say we haven't heard a word about that in this whole conference, so what did I know? In this paper, I will focus on an analogous but distinct and indeed reverse asymmetry. The claim that violating a moral duty has negative moral value, whereas fulfilling the same duty has no positive moral value. My line of inquiry is somewhat orthogonal to that of most papers in this conference, but perhaps discussion will reveal some illuminating connections. Here's an outline of the talk. I'll talk about the deontic value of fulfilling promises and other created kinds of duties, then the deontic value of non-created duties. Then I'll take a deeper look at ascribing this asymmetric deontic duties that I'm going to be arguing in favor of, looking at the difference between actualism and possibilism, looking at the notion of deontic value, looking at possible objections to the view I'm going to be pressing, the asymmetrical deontic value approach, and then finally drawing a conclusion and some implications. It's standardly assumed by many moral theorists, and indeed I myself assumed for many years, that within a deontological moral theory, fulfilling an obligation has positive deontic value, while violating such an obligation has negative value. However, in a previous paper, I partly abandoned this position to argue that we must ascribe negative deontic value to violating a promise, but no positive deontic value to keeping a promise. Only by taking this position can we avoid coming under wrongful duties to make promises and then keep them. If keeping a promise has positive deontic value, then we would have a derivative moral reason to make such a promise in order to garner the positive value of keeping it. But the idea that we ought to make promises in order to gain positive value from subsequently keeping them is counterintuitive in itself. No one thinks that I have reason to promise to go shopping this afternoon, which I'm planning to do anyway, just so that I can preen myself on keeping my promise when I do go shopping. As Elizabeth Anderson says of agents acting under a deontological theory, quote, "They do not take as their reason for action the thought that it's good to promote states of affairs in which commitments are fulfilled. This thought would, incoherently, encourage them to make commitments willy-nilly just so that more commitment fulfillments can exist in the world," unquote. But according positive value to keeping a promise has worse upshots than this. If we accord positive value to keeping a promise, we will be forced to conclude in certain perverse cases that an agent has a derivative obligation to make a promise to perform an action that it would otherwise be wrong for her to perform, even though common sense judges that she should neither make the promise nor keep it. This problem arises because whether or not an agent should perform a present action partly depends on what performing that action would lead her to do later on. Thus, an emergency technician should fill the oxygen tanks in his ambulance because doing so will lead to his saving lives later on. This is what I call a derivative obligation. But if keeping the promise itself has positive value, then any act of making a promise that leads to an agent's keeping that promise is guaranteed to produce that positive value, which in some cases may outweigh the negative value that the promised act otherwise has. Consider the following case. This is the lunch date case. On Tuesday, I will have an opportunity either to go to lunch with my colleague Jim or to go to lunch with my new colleague Rachel. Today, Monday, I run into Jim, and I have the opportunity to promise to go to lunch with him tomorrow. Rachel is presently out of contact, so there is no opportunity to make such a promise to her. In fact, if I go to lunch with Jim on Tuesday, our conversation will degenerate and he will feel insulted for a moral value of -2. On the other hand, if instead I go to lunch with Rachel, we will have a pleasant time and she will feel warmly welcomed to the department for a moral value of +3. If I make the promise to Jim, I will keep it, whereas if I don't make such a promise, I will wind up eating lunch with Rachel. If the standard view is correct, that both keeping and violating promises are relatively weighty moral matters, we could ascribe a moral value of +10 to keeping my promise, while ascribing a moral disvalue of -10 to breaking my promise. Thus, my options are as follows, and this is the lunch date case that you have, where the asterisk before an act indicates that it's the one I would performed if I performed the earlier act that it follows. So on Monday, if I promise to eat lunch with Jim, then on Tuesday I'll have a choice between eating lunch with Jim, which is worth -2 because he'll be insulted, but it's also worth +10 because that would be keeping my promise. On the other hand, I could violate my promise to him and eat lunch with Rachel instead, which is worth +3, but it would involve breaking the promise, which is worth -10, and so on. You can see how the other cases work. Evaluating my choices in this way generates an obligation to make the promise to Jim to have lunch with him, since by doing so, I achieve a total moral value of +8, greater than the moral value, merely +3, that I would achieve by not promising to eat lunch with him. But surely this is the wrong prescription. I should neither make a promise to meet Jim for lunch nor have lunch with him, but rather should make no promise and should have lunch on Tuesday with Rachel. In the earlier paper, I argued that the remedy for this is to deny that keeping the promise has any positive moral value, while continuing to assign breaking the promise negative value. Let's call this the asymmetrical Deontic value approach as regards promising. By employing it, we get a very different result in the lunch case as follows, and this is figure 2. Here, if I promise to eat lunch with Jim, then on Tuesday I eat lunch with him, which is worth -2 as before, and I keep my promise. That's fulfilling an obligation, but it gets 0 value there, and so forth. In this assessment of the case, I ought not to make the promise to Jim on Monday, since doing so would lead to my eating lunch with him on Tuesday, which has a disvalue of -2. Instead, I should make no promise on Monday, since making no promise would lead to my eating lunch with Rachel, which has a higher Deontic value of +3. This seems like exactly the recommendation that we want to make in this case. Of course, making a promise can sometimes have independent good effects that outweigh the negative effects of carrying it out. For example, my promising to eat lunch with Jim might lead him to have pleasurable expectations of a congenial lunch with me the following day, expectations whose beneficial effects actually outweigh the unpleasantness of our actual experience of the lunch. In such a case, making the promise might indeed be the right thing to do on Monday. But such independent effects do not always occur, or are insufficient to outweigh the negative value of the promised act itself. In cases lacking these counterbalancing extraneous effects, we do not want to prescribe making the promise. And I argued in that earlier paper that the best way to achieve this is to recognize that keeping the promise has no positive Deontic value in itself. In a more recent paper, I extended the asymmetrical Deontic value approach to all created duties. In making a promise, I create a duty. I make it the case that a subsequent act of mine becomes the ground for my fulfilling or violating a duty to keep that promise. But there are many other ways to create duties for oneself. A lover who impregnates a woman creates a duty to provide child support for the resulting child. A woman who backs her truck into another car creates a duty to compensate the owner of the car for the damage she has caused. A stroller who walks through a park comes under a duty to rescue a child drowning in a shallow pond, a case we're all familiar with. A duty he would not have had if instead he'd gone to the gym miles away. A woman who marries a man comes under a duty to care for him when he becomes ill. A hunter who buys a gun comes under a duty to ensure that children cannot get access to it. Indeed, it's probably the case that most of the duties we are under are ones that we created, in the sense that some earlier course of action we undertook resulted in our having that duty, when a different course of action would not have resulted in our having that duty. But any situation in which I have the opportunity to create a duty for myself is one in which the problematic dynamics described above in the case of promising can emerge. If fulfilling these created duties has positive Deontic value, just because it's the fulfillment of a duty, then the lover has derivative reason to impregnate the woman so that he can garner positive Deontic duty from keeping his positive Deontic value from keeping his ensuing duty to provide child support. The driver has reason to back into the car so that she can gain positive Deontic value from carrying out the ensuing duty to compensate the car's owner. The stroller has reason to walk through the park so that he can produce more Deontic value by fulfilling his ensuing duty to rescue the child. The fiancée has reason to marry so that she can garner greater Deontic value by fulfilling her subsequent duty to care for her husband. And the hunter has moral reason to buy a gun so that he can fulfill his ensuing duty to keep it from the children. Not only do we deny that these individuals have such derivative reasons, even prima facie reasons, to perform the acts creating these duties, but we judge that in many of these cases, the individuals ought not to perform the duty-creating acts at all. Thus, the argument that keeping a promise should not have positive Deontic value crops up across a wide swath of morality and shows that we should not accord positive Deontic duty to fulfilling any kind of created duty. Instead, we should only accord negative Deontic value to to violating creative duties. We shouldn't give positive value to fulfilling them. We should only give negative value to violating them. Otherwise, we'll be forced to draw counterintuitive conclusions about agents' obligations in situations where they have the opportunity to act in a way that will create a duty. B, the Deontic value of non-created duties. It's arguable that all of our duties are actually duties we create for ourselves in the sense that I've described. Perhaps all duties should be understood as, quote, a duty to do A in circumstances C, but our own choices determine whether or not we're in circumstances C, and the duty only requires concrete action when we're in C. However, I will assume that some of our duties are created by other persons for us. For example, a parent may conceive and then care for a child, creating a duty in the child to care for the parent if and when the parent is impoverished. In other cases, one may simply have a duty independent of the triggering action of any individual. Thus, I have a duty to respect all human beings, independently of what acts they or I concretely perform. In the longer version of this paper, I have a long section in which I debate whether any of this holds up, but I'm going to assume for the purposes of the paper that it does. Let us suppose that there are some genuinely non-created duties. Should we accord the fulfillment of these duties positive Deontic value, even though we shouldn't accord positive value to the fulfillment of created duties? The original argument for not according positive Deontic value to created duties would not seem to apply to the non-created duties. If I will have the duty independently of any act of mine, then I can have no derivative duty to create this non-created duty. Assigning the fulfillment of the non-created duty positive Deontic value does not seem to distort or to lead to counterintuitive derivative obligations on my part to create such duties. However, there is a different kind of an argument that shows we should not accord positive value to fulfilling non-created duties. To see this, consider the following case, supporting one's family. Paul fathers a child, Beth. He has a created duty to provide support for Beth. Paul is also the son of Andrew, who is impoverished. Paul has a duty, not created by him, to support Andrew. Paul himself is impoverished and has no funds to support either of his dependents. However, he now comes into a small inheritance, and can place it in a trust fund that will allow him to withdraw funds to support a designated beneficiary. He can designate either Beth or Andrew as the beneficiary, but for legal reasons, of the kind that philosophers always find, he cannot set up two trusts or set up a trust with both Beth and Andrew as beneficiaries. His duty to support Beth is slightly stronger than his duty to support Andrew. If he sets up the trust to benefit Beth, he will subsequently withdraw funds to benefit Beth, fulfilling his duty to support his child, but violating his duty to support his father. If he sets up the trust to benefit Andrew, he will subsequently withdraw funds to benefit Andrew, fulfilling his duty to support his father, but violating his duty to support his child. Let's assume that Paul's fulfilling his created duty to his daughter should receive no positive Deontic value, as I've been arguing, while his fulfilling his non-created duty to his father should receive positive value. Failing to fulfill the duty to support Beth has a negative Deontic value of -12, while failing to fulfill the duty to support Andrew has a slightly smaller negative Deontic disvalue of -10. Paul then faces the following choices, which you have in figure 3. So he can set up the trust to benefit Beth. Then he has a choice between supporting Beth, which gets 0 Deontic value, and not supporting, and would involve not supporting Andrew, which is worth -10. Or on the other hand, he can not support Beth, which is worth -12, and also not support Andrew. He could use the money for his own purposes, which is be worth -10. Or alternatively, he can set up the trust to benefit Andrew, and then he can use it to support Andrew, which gets +10 because he has a non-created duty to support Andrew, but that would involve not supporting Beth, which is worth -12, or he can fail to support either one of them. What we can see from figure 3 is that if fulfilling a non-created duty, that is supporting Andrew, has positive Deontic value, whereas fulfilling a created duty, supporting Beth, does not have any positive value, then in certain cases of conflict, which is what we have here, the non-created duty will outweigh the created duty, even though the created duty is a stronger duty. As Paul's duty to support Beth is a stronger duty than his duty to support Andrew. Thus, we get a derivative duty for Paul to set up the trust to benefit Andrew, since that will lead to a later act having a value of -2, whereas if he sets up the trust to benefit Beth, doing so would lead to a later act having a lower value of -10. Clearly, this way of assigning Deontic values to Paul's future acts distorts the recommendation that we want to make in this case. Given such a tragic conflict between these duties, we believe that Paul should obey his stronger duty to support Beth. However, we get the opposite recommendation when fulfilling his non-created duty to Andrew, but not his fulfilling his created duty to Beth, receives positive Deontic value. I conclude that once we decline to ascribe positive value to fulfilling created duties, we are forced to decline to ascribe positive value to fulfilling any duty, be it created or non-created, in order not to distort our prescriptions in cases where these kinds of duties conflict. Following this precept in Paul's case leads to the following correct results. This is figure 4. So here, supporting Beth gets 0 positive value, and also supporting Andrew gets 0 positive value. And it turns out that setting up the trust to benefit Beth has the least bad of the bad results in this case. So given these values, Paul ought to set up the trust to benefit Beth, since doing so would accrue a negative value of -10, whereas if he sets the trust up to benefit Andrew, doing so will accrue a worse negative value of -12. Section C. I've outlined the arguments for ascribing no positive value to fulfilling any obligation, whether it be created or non-created, while ascribing negative value to violating an obligation. This broad asymmetrical Deontic value approach appears to generate the correct derivative prescriptions when we're in a position to create our own future obligations, or when our created obligations conflict with our non-created obligations. Still, this approach may seem puzzling or problematic. In this section, I will examine some of the questions that may arise with regard to it and propose answers to these questions. So the first question is actualism versus possibilism. In describing the various cases I've discussed, I've implicitly taken the actualist position, the position that the derivative duty one has at earlier time, T1, depends on what the action at T1 would actually lead to at subsequent times. For example, in discussing lunch date, I said that if I promised Jim to have lunch with him, I would follow through and would have lunch with him, whereas if I made no promise, I would instead have lunch with Rachel. In earlier papers, I argued that this actualist position is roughly the correct position. However, many theorists, in fact, I'd say most theorists, disagree with this position and may worry that the whole argument in favor of the asymmetrical Deontic value approach relies on assuming the truth of actualism, and so is an argument that they can dismiss. They would hold that we can, without any theoretical cost, continue to ascribe positive value to the fulfillment of obligations so long as we stick to the correct position, namely possibilism, which says that the best action for an agent to perform at an earlier time is the one that will enable her to perform the highest valued action at the later time. Unluckily for the possibilist, her possibilism doesn't imply that ascribing positive Deontic value to fulfilling obligations is morally cost-free. To see this, consider again lunch date as represented in Figure 1, in which positive value is ascribed to my fulfilling my promise. In this case, the best act that my promising to eat lunch with Jim enables me to do, as the positivist asks, is to eat lunch with Jim and thereby keep my promise for a total Deontic value of +8. Whereas the best act that my not promising to eat lunch with Jim enables me to do is to eat lunch with Rachel for a total Deontic value of +3. Thus, I have a derivative obligation to promise to eat lunch with Jim, since this act would enable me to perform the subsequent act with the highest Deontic value, namely eating lunch with Jim. But as we've seen, this is a counterintuitive recommendation. Instead, my best option is not to make the promise. If we examine lunch date as represented in Figure 2, in which fulfilling obligations receives no positive value, we can see that it leads to a possibilist recommendation not to make the promise, since the best act that enables me to it enables me to perform, eating lunch with Rachel for a total Deontic value of +3, has higher Deontic value than the best act that making the promise enables me to perform, eating lunch with Jim for a total Deontic value of only -2. Thus, the problem produced by ascribing positive Deontic value to the fulfillment of obligations arises whether we are actualists or possibilists. Possibilism is not a way out of this. Given this, I will continue to approach these questions as an actualist. 2, Deontic value. I have used the concept of Deontic value in describing the moral value of acts of fulfilling or violating obligations. But what is Deontic value? Perhaps I'm appealing to an illegitimate concept that causes trouble in working out what an agent's derivative obligations are. As I conceive it, an act's Deontic value expresses the weight or the stringency of the duty to perform or not to perform an action, or in other terminology, the force of the moral reason to perform or not perform that act. Within a consequentialist moral theory, the need for such a concept is not prominent, since one can evaluate an action in terms of the value of its total consequences. But within a deontological moral theory, which recognizes that we have duties to perform actions that do not arise solely from their consequences, recognizing the importance of Deontic value is crucial. There are 3 different contexts in which such a measure of an action's moral value is important. First, when an agent, and I'm assuming here that the Deontic theory in question is one like W.D. Ross's, where there are multiple prima facie duties of various kinds. Things would go differently if there were only one such duty, but that seems to me very implausible, so I'll go with the multiple duties. First, when an agent has an option that would fulfill two prima facie duties, say prima facie duties F and G, but would violate a third prima facie duty, say H, then we need to weigh the stringency of the combination of F and G against the competing stringency of H. If all conflicts of prima facie duty conveniently involved merely the conflict between two such duties, let's say F versus H, then we could rest with the merely ordinal judgment that the prima facie duty to do F is stronger than the prima facie duty not to do H. However, when multiple prima facie duties, such as F and G, must be weighed against some opposing prima facie duty or set of duties, we need a mathematically stronger measure of the weight or the stringency of each prima facie duty. We can refer to this measure as the act's Deontic value insofar as it fulfills or violates a given prima facie duty. This case reveals that we need a measure of the stringency of each prima facie duty, but we also need a measure of the strength of the combination of all the prima facie duties that would be fulfilled or violated by a given action, so that we can weigh the overall moral reason to perform the action against the overall moral reasons to perform its alternatives. So I will speak of the Deontic value of fulfilling a prima facie duty and also of the Deontic value of the act as a whole. Second, whether we are actualists or possibilists, we need to determine whether we have a derivative obligation to perform an act in light of what subsequent acts it would lead to, that's the actualist position, or in light of what subsequent acts it would enable the agent to perform, that's the possibilist position. This is best done by ascertaining the Deontic value of the whole sequence of relevant acts that the target act would lead to or would enable the agent to perform. Here, too, we need a sufficiently mathematically powerful enough measure to permit doing something like adding the Deontic values of each act in the relevant sequence. Third, in cases where we need to ascertain the wisest act to perform, when we only have probabilistic information about the act's circumstances and consequences, even in a deontological theory, we sometimes want to recommend the act that has the greatest expected value, where the value in question is a measure of the strengths of the various reasons to perform that act. But to calculate the expected value of an act, we need to ascribe values to the act that can be weighed by the probability of their occurrence. Here again, we need a mathematically powerful measure of what I'm calling the act's Deontic value. Thus, I believe we cannot escape the need for a measure of the stringency of our duty to perform an action, a measure that I am calling its Deontic value. My discussion of the foregoing cases merely makes use of this notion, which we need in any case. In itself, the notion is not troublesome or the source of problems. It has to be said, however, that many deontologists would be uneasy about the notion of determining an action's derivative value by simply adding up the Deontic values of the acts that would follow it, or that it would enable the agent to perform. Their worry might be that this line of thoughts leads inevitably to a recommendation that the agent kill one innocent person to prevent her killing even more people later on, or to a recommendation that the agent must perform some act now in order to cause or enable other agents to carry out their duties later on. However, these worries do not show that there is a problem with the concept of Deontic value in itself. At most, it seems to me they show that a deontologist should be a possibilist rather than an actualist, or that the Deontic value of an act is agent-centered and even time-centered rather than agent and time-neutral, or something similar. A deontologist who wholly abjures the notion of Deontic value prevents his moral theory from dealing in a coherent and illuminating fashion with the balance of multiple competing duties, from connecting one's present duty with one's future actions, and from ascertaining what act is best in light of its probable consequences in nature. Section 3, possible objections to the asymmetrical Deontic value approach on this construal of Deontic value. In this section, I will consider two further worries that might be raised for the asymmetrical Deontic value approach. First, the asymmetrical approach implies that an act that fulfills several prima facie duties and violates none has the same deontic value as an act that is morally neutral, neither fulfilling nor violating any prima facie duties. This may seem highly counterintuitive, and it may suggest that there must be counterexamples to the asymmetric deontic view. It's indeed tempting to think that there must be a major moral difference between performing a morally neutral act and performing one that fulfills many prima facie duties and violates none. If there's no such difference, then we would have to conclude counterintuitively that a person who spends the week keeping her promises, telling the truth even when it's embarrassing, compensating others for damage she has caused them, and so forth, lives no better a moral life than someone who has never had the opportunity to do these things and spends the week performing nothing but morally neutral actions. But reflection thinks we don't always think this way. For example, we perform acts all the time that fulfill many prima facie duties, but we don't even think about this fact. You sit quietly in a concert, for example, and you never consider clawing or stabbing or stamping on the toes of the person next to you. In not performing these aggressive acts, you're fulfilling several prima facie duties, but you don't think any greater merit accrues to your conduct than you think accrues to some morally neutral act, such as opening your concert program when there's no one seated next to you. The proponent of the asymmetrical deontic value approach would agree that there is a moral difference between a morally neutral act and one that fulfills prima facie duties. But this proponent would argue that the difference between these acts is not a difference intrinsic to the acts themselves, but instead a difference between the moral characters of the alternatives to each of these acts. Suppose you're putting your shoes on in the morning, and a morally neutral act is tying your left shoe first. If you don't tie your left shoe first, then your alternative is to tie your right shoe first. This act, too, is morally neutral, so there's nothing at stake morally in which act you perform. There's no one within reach of you whom you could claw or stab. Consider, by contrast, an act that fulfills many prima facie duties but violates none. Suppose a professor asks Charlene whether her friend Ed cheated on a recent test. Charlene truthfully answers no, thus fulfilling her prima facie duty to tell the truth, as well as her prima facie duty to support her friend. If Charlene instead answers yes, or declines to answer, this would increase the professor's suspicion of Ed and lead to Ed's eventual suspension. Charlene's alternatives to saying no would each involve her violating several prima facie duties and would be morally bad choices. So there's a major moral difference between performing a morally neutral act and performing one that fulfills prima facie duties. But the difference arises from the nature of their alternatives, not from the intrinsic moral quality of the acts themselves. The asymmetrical deontic value proponent would say, in the case of the person who spends the week keeping promises, avoiding face-saving lies, and so forth, that she does live a morally better life than the person who merely performs a series of morally neutral acts. But the higher moral quality of her life emerges from two features of her situation. First, the fact that she had but didn't take alternatives that would have violated her prima facie duties. And second, the fact that these alternatives would have been personally preferable for her, but that nonetheless she fulfilled her duties. Her fulfilling her duties makes her life during that week morally better because she could have done much worse, and also because she makes personal sacrifices for morality that make her a better person than someone who only performs morally neutral actions requiring no such sacrifice. Another question that arises is how the asymmetrical deontic value approach works in the context of a consequentialist moral theory. So far, we've been considering this approach as a way of determining what deontic value to ascribe to fulfilling and violating the kinds of prima facie duties that are found in standard deontological moral theories. But how does this all work within a consequentialist moral theory? In the context of a pure consequentialist theory, the need for deontic values doesn't arise as it does in a pure deontological theory. In a consequentialist theory, each act is evaluated in terms of the value of its consequences, where those consequences are produced directly by the act or are produced through the acts leading to an intervening act, that directly produces the consequences. There are no opposing prima facie duties that need to be weighed against each other. The derivative value of an act is simply a function of the value of the consequences it would produce, directly or indirectly. And the expected value of an act is simply a function of the value of the possible consequences of the act weighted by the probabilities of their occurrence. We don't need an independent measure of the act's deontic value. So consider the following choice situation as it would be analyzed by a consequentialist concerned to maximize happiness. Suppose Randy has a choice when he's in college to major in creative writing or to major in finance. He would be equally happy in either major. If he majors in creative writing, he will become a good but impoverished poet. Whereas if he majors in finance, he will get a job on Wall Street and become rich. Later, he has a choice about what kind of charitable donation to make that would increase happiness. If he's a poet, he must choose between sending or not sending a copy of his latest poem to a fan who requests it. Sending the poem would make the fan quite happy, but not sending it would make the fan feel unhappily spurned. If Randy becomes a financier, he will have a choice between donating or not donating $100,000 to Oxfam. Donating the money will make a great many people very happy. Not donating it will leave them miserable. His choices then appear in figure 5. There's our hero Randy in his poet's shirt and his banker's suit. Okay, so he's making the choice what to major in 2015, and then in 2025 he has this opportunity to be generous. If he goes into creative writing, he can choose between sending the poem or not. If he goes into finance, he can choose between giving the $100,000 or not. Randy's a good-hearted fellow. So if he becomes a poet, he will send his poem to his fan. Well, if he becomes a financier, he will give the $100,000 to Oxfam. His derivative duty, then, is to major in finance, since the value of the happiness that would be achieved is 1,000 units. It's tricky to calculate what these units are in these cases, but this is how I chose to do it in this case. Whereas if he majors in creative writing, the value of the happiness that would be achieved is only 10. From a consequentialist perspective, this seems correct, and the calculation is reasonably straightforward. However, matters become less straightforward in the most commonly held kind of moral theory, which combines deontological elements with consequentialist ones, perhaps giving agents a prima facie duty to keep promises, but also a prima facie duty to help others. Since this hybrid deontological theory involves prima facie deontological duties, we must make use of the notion of deontic value in assessing which acts are best. We need a method of comparing the relative weights of deontological duties with the weights of potentially conflicting consequentialist duties. This means we must also ascribe deontic value to acts that fulfill or violate a prima facie duty to produce certain kinds of consequences. Settling the deontic value of such prima facie consequentialist duties is tricky. One question is what weight these consequentialist prima facie duties have as compared to the weight of the purely deontological ones. Thus, within an asymmetrical view, some hybrid codes might ascribe higher disvalue to the violation of consequentialist duties to help or not harm others than they ascribe to the violation of deontological duties, such as keeping one's promises and telling the truth. Other hybrid codes might reverse this relative valuation. Another question is whether the weights of the consequentialist duties themselves might vary. For example, violating a duty not to harm might have greater disvalue than violating a duty to help. Still, a third question is whether the consequentialist duties are comparative, such as a prima facie duty to minimize the amount that one hurts others, or whether they're absolute, such as a prima facie duty not to hurt others at all. There are other possible variables as well. All of this makes a difference to what deontic values are to be ascribed to the consequentialist prima facie duties. We cannot canvass all of these possibilities, so for simplicity, let's focus on a hybrid code that includes a single consequentialist duty to maximize the net benefit or minimize the net harm one produces, and that deems placing a greater net benefit to be better, that deems producing a greater net benefit to be better than producing a smaller net benefit. The most obvious way to ascribe Deontic values to the violations of this duty is to ascribe a Deontic disvalue to the violation of this duty that's a function, some function, of the opportunity cost as measured in utiles of performing a less than optimal act. Thus, if the agent acted to produce minus 20 utiles when she could instead have produced plus 40 utiles, the Deontic disvalue of her act would be some function of her opportunity cost of minus 60 utiles. Precisely what function this is would depend how much weight the hybrid code assigns to violating the consequentialist duty as compared to violating the deontological duties. For simplicity, I'll simply ascribe violating the consequentialist duty the same Deontic disvalue as the opportunity cost in utiles of the agent's act, a Deontic disvalue of minus 60 in the case I just described. Let's see how all this plays out. Suppose Randy, the would-be poet or financier, while in high school, promised his dying mother that if he ever became a writer, he would send any fan who requested it a copy of his work. Then his option of sending a poem to his fan would fulfill this promise, while his option of not sending it would violate the promise. He made no promises about donating money to charity. His mother didn't think about that. Let's assume that violating a promise is worth minus 100 in Deontic value on this hybrid deontological code. As a poet, violating his consequential deontological duty to produce maximum benefit has an opportunity cost of minus 20, so violating this duty has a Deontic value of minus 20. If financier Randy doesn't donate to charity, he violates the duty to produce maximum net benefit for an opportunity cost and Deontic disvalue of minus 3,000. His act leaves people experiencing minus 2,000 in utiles when he could instead have brought about their experiencing plus 1,000 in utiles. In our previous cases, I assumed that the earlier acts, such as Randy's choosing a major, were morally neutral, apart from any derivative value they might accrue because of the Deontic value of the subsequent acts they would lead to. But on the hybrid theory, Randy's act of choosing a major is not morally neutral apart from its derivative value, unlike the earlier acts in our previous cases. For example, his act of choosing creative writing fails to produce as much benefit as possible via his subsequent acts, so it directly violates his prima facie consequentialist duty to produce as much benefit as possible. Hence, in addition to its derived value, it should be assigned a negative value of violating that duty. So that's all displayed here in Figure 6. Thus, we can understand Randy's options as displayed in Figure 6. On the asymmetrical view, fulfilling the prima facie duty of keeping a promise and fulfilling the prima facie duty to maximally benefit would each have a Deontic value of 0. If Randy majors in creative writing, his sending the poem in 2025, which fulfills his promise and maximizes benefits, would have a total Deontic value of 0. Whereas his not sending the poem, which fails to maximize benefits and violates his promise, would have a Deontic disvalue of minus 120. If Randy majors in finance, his giving $100,000 to charity would neither fulfill nor violate a duty to keep a promise and would fulfill his duty to maximize benefits. Hence, it would have a Deontic value of 0, since fulfilling duties is ascribed no Deontic value. His not giving the money to charity would neither fulfill nor violate a duty to keep a promise, but would violate the duty to maximize benefits when he could instead have helped a great deal for a Deontic value of minus 3,000. Randy's earlier choosing creative writing violates his prima facie duty to maximize benefits via his subsequent act. It has an opportunity cost of minus 990, 10 utiles minus the 1,000 utiles he could otherwise have produced, and so should be assigned a Deontic value of minus 990. His earlier choosing to major in finance would fulfill his prima facie duty to produce the greatest possible benefit, since it would produce 1,000 utiles to his charitable beneficiaries, less the 10 utiles he doesn't produce because he doesn't write and send his poem to the fan, for a total of 990. So on the asymmetry view, it should be ascribed a Deontic value of 0. We can see that Randy ought to major in finance, just as we intuitively think, because the total intrinsic and derivative value of majoring in creative writing is minus 990, whereas the total intrinsic and derivative value of major union finance is 0. This case strongly suggests that the asymmetrical view delivers the correct results for hybrid moral theories as well as for pure deontological ones. Of course, one case does not constitute a proof, and given the vast array of possible kinds of hybrid theories, perhaps no such proof will be forthcoming. Nonetheless, our examination of Randy's case doesn't raise any red flags about applying the asymmetric view in the context of such theories. Conclusion and implications. In this paper, I've described the asymmetrical Deontic value approach, which assigns no Deontic value to the fulfillment of duties, but assigns negative Deontic value, disvalue, to the violation of such duties. I've argued that this approach is required for the duty of keeping promises, and indeed for all duties that one creates for oneself. I've argued even more strongly that once we've deployed the asymmetric approach to assigning Deontic values to created duties, we must use it for all duties, whether they are created or not. In the last section, I considered two objections that might be raised to the asymmetrical approach and argued that neither of them succeeded in revealing any serious problems for it. Indeed, in considering the application of the asymmetric approach to hybrid moral theories, ones that incorporate both deontological and consequentialist duties, we can see a hitherto unnoticed virtue of such hybrid theories. If the asymmetric view is correct, then nothing in the nature of deontological duties as such provides us any reason to create such duties for ourselves. Nonetheless, we believe it sometimes would be morally good to create such duties. Adding a consequentialist element to our moral theory explains how this can be so. I've argued that fulfilling a deontological duty has no Deontic value in itself. However, fulfilling such a duty often has good consequences for the welfare of those affected by the action. Suppose a neighbor asks me to look after her dog so that she can go on vacation. If I don't do it, she will not be able to go on vacation for a total disvalue of minus 75 utiles. I won't take care of the dog unless I promise to do so. If I promise, my keeping my promise would have 0 Deontic value for fulfilling this prima facie duty. But making the promise has high consequentialist value for my neighbor, whereas my not making the promise has negative consequential value for her. If it's a small matter to me, then I ought to make the promise because not making it would violate my consequential duty to help others. We can see this in Figure 7. Figure 7 shows that I ought to promise to take care of my neighbor's dog because doing so has a total value of 0, whereas not making the promise would have a total value of minus 150. These considerations show that consequential duties are important partners for pure deontological duties in producing the full set of prescriptions we hope a moral theory will deliver, but that no moral theory can deliver if it confines itself to deontological duties alone and simultaneously obeys the asymmetrical Deontic value approach, as I've argued that it must. Thank you.